Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the impact of the US elections on the MENA region. I am Anise Bassiri-Tabrizi. I'm a senior research fellow, and I lead the Unpacking the Middle East and North Africa program here at RUSI. I am delighted to be joined by a great group of experts today, all of which are affiliated with RUSI. I won't go over the bios for the sake of time, but all of them are available on our website, so feel free to go and check them out. I am just going to start very quickly because given the breadth and of their expertise, we will be literally touring the Middle East and North Africa today. We are going to assess the impact of a Biden administration and reaction from different capitals in the region, and more generally trying to get a sense of whether there is going to be any change and on what issues the US is going to be given a priority in the MENA region. I'll be starting by asking a series of questions to our speakers, and then I will open up to the Q&A. But in the meantime, feel free to already start to write down your questions in the Q&A box, and I will do my best to get as many of them as possible to our experts. Right, I would like to start with one of the concepts which I think has been the most stressed by the Biden administration when it comes to the foreign policy agenda, the ending the forever wars kind of concept. He has argued several times that the US should end the forever wars and bring back the vast majority of its troops from wars in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Antonio Giustozzi, Afghanistan obviously features high in the list of forever wars. So I think on one side, when he is talking about ending the forever wars, but also about maintaining a presence to ensure that neither Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State is in a position to launch attacks on the US. This is kind of telling of the problematic challenges ahead of the Biden administration when it comes specifically to Afghanistan. Could you tell us a little bit more about what do you anticipate happening there under a Biden administration? What the reaction has been?
Well, hello to everybody. Well, for what we know, the current timeline implies that the US armed forces will only have 2,500 men left in Afghanistan by January next year. So unless Biden decides to send troops back in, which I really don't think he will do, I don't think there's no appetite in America among the public or any politician or any caller for doing that. So unless he sends more troops in, there's not much he can do with 2,500 men. You know, most of them will not be combat. I don't even know whether they can afford to keep a full fighter bomber squadron there. It takes about 1,000 men just for that. So the option will be limited. The idea of keeping a presence in order to monitor global jihadists of all stripes is only viable if there is a standing agreement with the Taliban. If the Taliban cooperate with that, it might be doable. If not, with that level of presence, I don't think it's going to be possible. And in fact, what you will have a civil war in the country, if the current discussion breaks down. So you don't want to be there with a very limited presence, with a very light footprint. So I think Biden will come under pressure from different quarters about the next steps. Clearly, this is not a priority for him. There are other issues that he will have to deal with first. So I think that the most he can do to appease some of the lobbies that will be putting pressure on him, some are external to the administration, but some will be, for example, within the Pentagon. There is a strong lobby that argues we should stay. And even within State Department, many who think America somehow, one way or another, should stay. So in order to make them happy, at least for some time, he might freeze the withdrawal, which, by the way, is not confirmed. The Trump administration not confirmed that they will be leaving in any case, even if Trump stayed as president. I know they're not confirmed they will be leaving by May next year. So in a sense, there is already a freeze. And Biden could just keep that freeze in place as he tries to his diplomats. We don't know whether Khalid will stay as an envoy or not, but might try to see where they can negotiate something slightly different with the Taliban. But I think overall, it won't have much leverage. The Taliban now believe the Americans won out in any case, and 2,500 is not such a great deterrent force that could have a major impact on the ground if things went to go really rogue. So I think his option will be limited.
The Afghan government seems optimistic that a Biden administration will adopt a tougher stance on the Taliban. And they're also hoping, it seems, that this could provide them with more leverage in the intra-Afghan negotiations which are taking place with the Taliban in Doha. Do you think their hopes are well placed, or do you think this is a very optimistic take, given what you said?
I think this feeling is based on the interaction that the Afghan government has had over the last several months with American officials, State Department, the military. And as I said, there is a strong stream of opinion there that the Americans should stay. In fact, the Americans should not have actually made an agreement with the Taliban in the first place. Now it's a bit too late for that. The problem is that Biden will face, the administration Biden will face a fait accompli, essentially. By the time it gets there won't be much left. So going back is going to be hard, and I don't think he really wants to do that. Biden was never very much of an enthusiast in the Afghan conflict, even when he was a vice president. So, it was really not something I would expect. I think the Afghan government had a clearly bad relation with Trump, so they think anything would be better than that. They might hope that maybe Biden, a little bit bluffing probably, might pretend that, he doesn't agree to a withdrawal. I don't know whether the Taliban will buy that. And I don't know what Biden will do with the Taliban keep escalating military pressure on Kabul, because, you can re-engage, but with what? They don't have much in terms of assets left on the ground. They will have even less in January. And when the Taliban launched the offensive in Helmand in October, there was not much of an American reaction, and it will be even less next spring if the Taliban go back on the offensive. So, of course, the Afghan government got the problem of trying to instill some optimism and faith in his troops, because the morale is pretty low in the Afghan army and police. So, that politics, you try to, you need to keep things going regardless of what the actual options are. Whether they really believe in it, I think they have at least some reason to think that it would be slightly better with Biden. Whether they will change anything substantially, I'm not convinced.
Thank you. Well, moving on to another forever war, if you wish, Iraq, Gary Stansfield. I was wondering, when it comes to Iraq, the policy seems very similar to the one in Afghanistan from a Biden point of view, meaning bringing back US troops and maintaining a small counterterrorism presence there. So I wonder, what do you think this means for the future US-Iraq relations, and what are the expectations in Baghdad, but also in Erbil?
Thank you, Anissa, and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I do agree with you that there are some similarities in the Biden position, as it seems right now, between Iraq and Afghanistan, and the numbers are similar. So by the end of this year, the projected troop drawdowns in Iraq will be down to 3,000, which and then we're getting into the realms of counterterrorism operations. If we look at Biden's history with Iraq, he goes back a long way. I mean, he voted for the Iraq War. As a senator, the Delaware senator, he authored the Biden-Gelb plan on promoting decentralization, even federalism within Iraq, that many Iraqis saw as a means to divide the country. The Kurds, of course, supported it fully. And as a vice president, he was heavily involved with the withdrawal of troops. He visited Iraq a lot as well, 27 times. So there is a view in Iraq that he knows them, he knows the political elite, he knows the dynamics very well. And that's certainly the view, I think, that is seen in Erbil as well. That then brings different questions about what people there think he will do. There's a range of different opinions, and recognizing that Iraq has moved on in many ways since 2003 as well, and it's not the same place. In some ways, it's no longer a subject of American foreign policy. We can use that language. It's more of an object. It's more of the appendage to what American foreign policy will be towards Iran and perhaps even towards Turkey. And the impact on Iraq will be where the policy is rather than what happens in Iraq itself. And with that in mind, of course, the relationship with Iran in particular is absolutely paramount when it comes to understanding what the American position towards Iraq will be. So in terms then of how Baghdad is viewing this, it depends on which Baghdad as well and which part of the Iraqi political spectrum. And again, recognizing the presence of the Iranian aligned Shia militias, the sheer level of influence that Iran has from Baghdad down to Basra now, but also the heavy amount of influence that Iran has amongst Sunni groups and political communities, and of course into Kurdistan as well. It really is an Iran-focused Iraqi policy that we will begin to see emerge. Will that mean that, there is a view that Biden will engage again more closely with the JCPOA and find a way to not have Iran so antagonistically positioned towards the US in Iraq, so that the US can then continue with its CT operations and position against Islamic State? That is there. There is a fear, though, that he could also become more engaged in the reinvigorating of Iraqi democracy as well, and where does that take it, particularly with regards to the heavy presence of the Shia militia and the relatively the decay of democratic processes within Iraq that has been happening. But to again emphasize that I think and just to return to Erbil, as you mentioned, Erbil and Kurdistan in particular, I think there is a view that he will be pro-Kurdish. I think, though, that is in keeping with how Kurdish politicians tend to view new presidents coming in, that they view them very positively, and yet, but then disappointed as the new administration basically has to adapt to a position that is in keeping with previous ones, which is to maintain Iraq's territorial integrity. But the position, I think, is that Iraq is very much marginalized. It's marginalized in itself in terms of its own actions. Its economy is now very much broken. It's now no longer central to American interests. As US interests now have to look towards GCC, Saudi Arabia, events in Turkey and the Eastern Mediterranean, of course, and top of the list in the Middle East, and Egypt, and then top of the list in the Middle East is the relationship with Iran and how that moves forward. So again, just to go back to that phrase, I think Iraq has become much more of an object in this foreign policy game rather than an actual subject itself, and it's going to be pulled and pushed according to the currents and trends that we see emerge towards Iran particularly, but also towards Turkey and countries of the GCC.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, I just wanted to tease out a little bit from what you just said, especially when it comes to the Shia militias, especially the one that are backed by Iran. I mean, they have welcomed the election of Biden. And I think the main reason is that they see a Biden presidency as bringing about less tensions than what we have seen under Trump. Probably a less anti-Iran policy from the US perspective in Iraq, a more counterterrorism, Daesh-focused one. So do you think they're right in celebrating a Biden presidency? Or do you think is there room for Biden actually to work more closely with Kadhimi in kind of curtailing their strength over the next 4 years?
It's a good question, Anissa. I'd expect nothing else. It could go either way, couldn't it? I mean, this is not even early days yet. The days haven't started. I think that there is a possibility that we see a more, of course, constructive, predictable perhaps, but equally a sort of muscular approach from Biden to again bring American influence back into America in a way that is constructive, diplomatic, working with political elites, building democratization, all of these sorts of things, rather than the pure military levers that have tended to be pulled previously. But you know, Iraq is a different place again. I mean, the power of these militias, of of the Shia blocs that are aligned with Iran are such that there's not a lot of space for American for the new American administration to maneuver in Iraq either. So there's a new way into Iraq has to be found by the Biden administration, as the old ways in are no longer there.
Thank you, Garrett. Mike, I wonder whether we can move to the GCC, since Garrett mentioned how relevant and important this area will be moving forward. Biden has been very vocal about the fact that he would end the US support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. He also vowed to reset relations with Saudi Arabia, more broadly speaking. And it seems there could be a stark difference from the posture that Trump adopted towards, in particular, Saudi Arabia. His first overseas trip was to Riyadh, and obviously they had very close relationship over the past 4 years. So can you tell us a bit about the mood in Riyadh?
Sure. Well, this is a bit of a moving target, because the Trump administration, which, as Pompeo seems to believe, will hand over to another Trump administration, has currently accelerated all of its policies with regard to the Gulf in the last 24 hours. So what we're seeing is the provision of the F-35, the MQ-9 armed drone, and some anti-aircraft missiles, which may or may not be sold to the UAE between now and January 20th. It looks like Pompeo is going to go on a tour of the region as well, and he's going to double down on some of the states that the Trump administration has had strong relationships with, and back that up with, as you will know, what looks to be new, very, very tough sanctions on the Iranians. So the Saudis and the Emiratis might well get what they want from Trump, and that will lock Biden into effectively a set of processes that he can't undo very quickly. So regardless of what Biden thinks, or what some advisors around Biden may think, they may simply not have the flexibility to maneuver in the way that perhaps they would have done had the Trump administration effectively behaved like a normal administration. So that is something I really can't tell you what's going to happen, because I think what will happen is on January 21st, Biden's team will come in, and they may well be presented with a slightly different US relationship with the Gulf than exists currently. And these will be things that they just simply can't undo. Now, it's obvious, Trump advisors, Daniel Benaim, Tony Blinken, a couple of others, have long experience of working with the Gulf, and they have made their ideas known over the course of this year about what they think should be done. And Daniel Benaim has talked about a slow reset in relations with Saudi Arabia. Now, I don't think it's particularly insightful that we know that the Biden administration will have some issues with Saudi Arabia. It's not really a secret. The question is how they go about managing that relationship. Of course, Saudi Arabia is still Saudi Arabia. That's still the most important Arab country by most metrics. And whether you are Biden or Trump, you will have to deal with the Saudis on a number of regional questions, particularly Iran. And I don't actually see the Biden administration suddenly going soft on Iran's regional activity just because they want to get the JCPOA in place. So that will, I think, keep the Saudis happy. What I think has been slightly problematic from the Saudi side is that they can't really identify what they want a US administration to do in the region. They sort of like Trump because he was tough on Iran, but they could never identify what they wanted the maximum pressure strategy to do. Was it to get Iran back to the negotiating table? Was it simply to keep Iran locked in a box? Was it to help them win in Yemen? Frankly, MBS never really made that clear. And so actually, if Biden can achieve some of those with a slightly different approach, I don't see why the Saudis will be so upset. I think what they're upset about is that they don't, or they won't have the hotline into Jared Kushner. Let's be honest, the Saudis like to do business right up at the top in a very personalized way. It's what happened in the Bush II administration and the Bush I administration, and even to some extent with Clinton. That would not exist under a Biden administration, and I think they're struggling to understand how to maneuver. They did know that this potential was coming, that they would face an administration that was not as amenable as the Trump administration, and they've been trying to mitigate that, doing a lot of work on the Hill and in Congress. but I think it's going to be a tougher 4 years for them than it had been. The other country I just want to briefly mention, obviously Uae Qatar. There's a lot of talk about whether the Biden administration will go and help solve this dispute between Qatar and its neighbors. I'm not sure it's the Americans' job to fix it. There have been numerous attempts by the Trump administration, who also wanted to fix this problem, to bring the three sides together, and it's not happened. My line has always been the same. It will get fixed when it gets fixed. Both Qatar and Saudi Arabia seem to want to patch things up. I'm not so sure the Emiratis do. The second order effect of this F-35 deal may well be that both the Qataris and the Saudis want F-35s as well. In which case, what do you do as the US administration? You've got these three countries, which are all basically staring at each other in rivalry, and you're going to arm them to the teeth. There's some really odd precedents here, and I don't envy the Biden administration.
Thanks, Mike. But following up on this, I think, mindful of how complicated it is to forecasting all of that, the fact that somehow the security guarantees that the United States was providing to the Gulf countries, in particular in Riyadh, I mean, especially after the Uae attack, there has been obviously a reconsideration of what the US is willing and able to do for the Gulf countries. So I guess my question is, do you think because of the Biden administration, there is going to be a more willingness to reconsider their posture, say in Yemen, or even engagement with Iran, or even the Qatar crisis you just mentioned? So we know that this is something separate. But in terms of the security guarantees, do you think it makes Saudi Arabia more amenable to resolution of conflict and de-escalation, or not?
It's a good question. The Saudis know that Yemen is the pressure point. They know that it's the single biggest issue, obviously, behind the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, that has lost them support amongst Democrats and Republicans in Washington. There is no doubt in my mind that the Americans want to see an end to Yemen. The question is how and in what ways, and whether the conditions on the ground allow that to happen. You can have all the goodwill in the world. And by the way, there were concerted efforts under the Trump administration to try and bring this Yemen war to a close, and that's not worked either. So, Biden may want to put the pressure on the Saudis there. MBS may want to give him something on that file, which then sort of negates this need for perhaps cessation of arms sales, and something very embarrassing where Biden might have to make a choice about whether to veto bills that go into the House and the Senate or not. But the truth is that I expect that the conditions in Yemen will continue as they are. With regards to security guarantees, I think that the Biden administration will be more clear about what its security guarantees are, but under the framework that actually they would like to be moving assets further east towards China, and also they see Russia as the biggest threat. Tony Blinken was very, very, very clear this sort of autumn, where he said, look, we're going to be moving assets out of the Middle East. That's just inevitable. The question is not how many troops you have on the ground in the Middle East. You don't need 50,000 people sitting in the Persian Gulf for it to be secure. It's about what security guarantees you give and what conditions you provide those security guarantees under. So with Trump, as you mentioned, Saudi Arabia got attacked. The Americans did nothing. I think what you'll see from the Biden administration is a far clearer set of, okay, if this happens, we respond. If Iran does X, we will do Y, which doesn't actually require as much of a footprint. It just requires determination and consistency, which is what I think they will bring. It doesn't, by the way, necessarily mean that it's a better arrangement. It just means that it's more consistent.
Thanks, Mike. Well, we already touched on Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. So I wonder whether, Hisham, you can talk a little bit about this, axis that has been shaping over the past few years in the Middle East, with one side Qatar and Turkey, on the other side having the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. And I wonder whether you think that a Biden administration will strengthen or weaken this trend, if at all.
Thank you, Anissa. So just picking up where Michael left off, as you mentioned, there are these two axes that have sort of, formalized themselves over the past 5 years or so. And I find it impossible for us to really understand the wider Middle East without identifying those axes and seeing how they play out on these different sort of hot topics. And later on, we'll talk about Libya as one example. So the first axis is obviously Turkey and Qatar. The second axis is Egypt, Saudi, and the UAE. And the rest of the region will tack towards one of those axes, one way or the other. And I'll speak briefly about Israel and the occupation later on. What's interesting to me about both of these axes, they were both, even though they're at loggerheads with each other on a number of different files within the region, they would have both been very happy to see a Trump administration, as Mr. Pompeo hinted there might be from 2021 going forward. And I think that they're all feeling a little bit, let's say, under the weather as a result of the election result. I have to say, with the exception of the UAE, because I think the UAE tried to ensure that irrespective of whether or not it was a Trump administration that came back or a Biden administration, that they had developed enough guarantees to be able to move forward in a manner that met their interests. So when you look at Turkey, I think that Erdogan has actually benefited a great deal from the Trump administration the last few years. And Biden is already on record as saying certain things about Turkey, and particularly about the Kurds, that won't make people very happy in Ankara. And you've already seen this play out in the Turkish media, but I won't say too much about that because I'm far more interested in hearing what Zia has to say on that particular file. When it comes to the Saudis and the UAE, Michael's already spoken about that, and I would agree. I'd also say when it comes to Egypt, Egypt's president Abdel Fattah al-Sisi got called out by Biden earlier this year in July as, quote unquote, Trump's favorite dictator, a line that Trump actually came up with and was reported in the press. And Biden was criticizing Sisi and Cairo for various human rights violations. Now, having said that, Cairo very, very quickly congratulated Biden on having won the election, because I think Cairo will work with whatever administration is in DC, and frankly, vice versa. So I think that that's very clear going forward, that the relationship is going to continue. But I think that we can expect that under a Biden administration, unlike the Trump administration, there are probably going to be a few more public statements coming out of the State Department, out of the White House, where they see human rights violations taking place on the ground in Egypt, and probably in other places as well. This was extremely rare, obviously, under the Trump administration. So the atmosphere, the permissive environment, as it were, I think will reduce somewhat under a Biden administration. And now I think that that's very important to keep in mind also when it comes to normalization of Israel in the region, the different agreements that have been proposed. When you look at how the Trump administration engaged on the Israeli-Palestinian file, the U.S. Embassy was moved to Jerusalem under Trump. Funding of UNRWA, the United Nations agency responsible for Palestinian refugees, was cut. The PLO mission in Washington was closed. And the Trump administration lobbied very hard within the Arab world to politically normalize with Israel. And certainly with regards to Sudan, there was basically extortion. Really quite, I have to say, quite a shameful policy, considering the very, very difficult situation that the Sudanese find themselves within on a humanitarian and economic basis. And all of that went against an expectation in various capitals that there would be normalization after a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was arrived at. And the much vaunted deal of the century sort of put all of that to one side. And none of the underlying issues with regard to the occupation of the Palestinian territories by Israel, the refusal to allow refugees back, the status of Jerusalem, all of that didn't really get very far at all. Now, with Biden, I don't think the Palestinians can expect, a bunch of new friends in Washington. I think that they can expect fewer enemies. So I expect UNRWA to be refunded quite quickly, and I expect the PLO mission to reopen. And I expect that Israel's government will find it far more politically difficult to move forward on annexation of different Palestinian territories. I don't expect the Jerusalem embassy decision to be rescinded. On the contrary, I think that stays as now the new status quo. So the bar is set quite low in terms of how engaging with the Palestinians is going to go. But it has been, I think it has been for a very long time in Washington, D.C. So I think that sort of uneven relationship, to put it mildly, is going to continue for quite some time, but it's going to be slightly less problematic under a Biden administration for the Palestinians.
Thank you. Zia, obviously, Turkey has already featured, Hisham already mentioned it, but also there are already 2 questions on Turkey, which obviously is of interest. By the way, I just wanted to remind everyone to start putting down their questions so I can raise them to the speakers. But yeah, obviously, there is a lot of speculation about the nature of US-Turkey relations under a Biden administration. Erdogan was one of the last officials to congratulate Biden, probably signaling the general mood in Turkey. But also Biden has been a frequent critic of the Turkish president. He has been calling him an autocrat. He has been criticizing lately also the Turkey's intervention in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So I guess my question to you is, how do you expect Turkey-US relations to develop under a Biden administration?
So ironically, I think, if you reflect on what has happened in Turkey-US relations since Obama, right? Not just during Trump, it's been at one of its worst kind of historical, lowest common denominator kind of relationship for a very long time. So in some sense, Biden's arrival doesn't necessarily solve a lot of the issues that have been left over from Obama era, like Syria and the S-400 question and Turkey's domestic direction and the serious disagreements over how the fight in Syria against Daesh has gone and etc. So these things Trump have inherited and didn't help. And I don't think Biden can easily solve them, but I think the view from Ankara is Trump has been personally a brake pedal on some of the pressures that are built against Turkey in DC. I mean, it's a non-partisan issue. I mean, the consensus in Washington, DC politically, in terms of foreign policy issues, defense issues, security issues, Turkey is really not seen as how it was seen, as a tricky but a reliable ally that we need to work with. So the calls against Turkey are quite loud and clear. But what Biden will change on this is going to be the question of sanctions vis-a-vis the activation of S-400, right? So Trump couldn't necessarily solve that issue. The question of Syria, again, I mean, it is at a particular point. James Jeffrey, the envoy, is leaving his post, and there's some sort of a ceasefire and understanding. But again, we're leaving these things really not clearly defined. So I think the biggest loss for Erdogan is going to be that personal access he enjoyed with Donald Trump. He's not going to get that with Biden. The way the US foreign policy has also fragmented and got personalized under Trump, which is what Erdogan has enjoyed, it's probably not going to sustain itself. In other words, it will be very difficult to just call Biden, get him agree on something on some of the critical issues like punishment over the sanctions, the regulation with Halkbank, as well as sanctions that might come because of the S-400s and etc. and questions over Syria. That has ended. So there's no way of going back to that kind of personal two friends trying to find a deal. But again, solutions are really difficult to find in this space. What is it that we want to achieve? But at the same time, I also want to highlight there might also be opportunities, right? It's too soon to see what Biden will do, even though he's been very critical since he left the office of Erdogan and Turkish policies and Karabakh, as you rightfully mentioned, and other issues like the treatment of Kurds and etc. When he comes into the office as the president, and obviously responsibilities change, perspectives change. Looking at the broader conversation on his views on the GCC questions, Israel, Iran, and NATO, in fact, is very positive views towards NATO and his belief in the importance of alliances and etc. Actually, changes in this space could give us some maneuvering room with Turkey, rather than take the side of, for example, Greece and Cyprus and UAE and Egypt. Well, US actually might very well be again, another strong arbiter and a pressure point for everybody to find a solution and a consensus rather than actually box Turkey or isolate Turkey in ISTMET. And that might actually give us some breathing space. And again, Iran is an example of where any change in policy towards Iran actually opens up more positive conversations with Turkey. Again, none of these things are easy portfolios to manage at all. And the relationship, the trust towards each other has been broken down since Obama days. So you could see Trump was actually some sort of a brake pedal for things to completely collapse. But with Biden and his other overall foreign policy portfolios and challenges, it's not clear to me whether it will make it worse or better. But I think there are opportunities as well as risks in that conversation.
Thank you, Zia. But what do you think in terms of Turkish projection and foreign policy? Do you see a potential for Turkey to getting closer to Russia, or even like in terms of activism in the region? Do you see a potential for Turkey to become more or less active under a Biden administration? I know it's $1 million question, but I wonder whether you can say a couple of words.
Look, I think there's nothing magical about what Turkey is trying to do. It's a middle power or an emerging power in a geography that it sees as in chaos, in big powers and other powers are trying to grab what they can grab and isolate it. And the only way it sees to be part of the interests and outcomes and developments is to assert itself. That's why it did in Syria. That's why it's doing it in over questions of energy resources off the shores of Cyprus and Greece, and backing Azerbaijan and so on. So it's not necessarily choosing between NATO versus Russia, America versus Iran. It's genuinely trying to be have a strategic independence. Now, the question is this sustainable when you're alienating everybody? Russia is not an ally, so nobody in Ankara sees Russia as an ally. It's a competitor at the same time as a country they can not ignore. They have to work with, same as Iran. They're in direct competition with all these countries. And the overall global picture where US's attention isn't really Karabakh, and sympathies might lie with Armenia in terms of US domestic political perspectives, but it's not really a priority for US. Cyprus, again, what is that going to mean with Biden? I'm not really certain. So from Turkey's perspective, the world has been quite aggressive in its neighborhood, in its region, and the only way it can, what it sees as protecting its interests and its position is to assert itself. But in the process, it put itself in a very difficult box. It lost all relationships, severed every relationship it can have, while it cannot get out of NATO because it does need NATO against Russia, but it also needs to work with Russia. So in the process, it severed relationships in all sorts of direction, and it's not sustainable. So I think in the long run, the challenge for Turkey is to say, well, yes, these are the regional developments. Yes, you need to be assertive. Yes, you need to be on the negotiating table. Yes, you want to be an active voice, understandable, but you can't go about it this way. You can't pick a fight. You can't buy S-400s and think that you can also utilize NATO as a deterrence for yourself. So those paradoxes in Turkish foreign policy, very personalized decision-making at the moment, are going to undermine it for a very long time.
Thank you, Zia. Well, we already talked about Libya a couple of times, and especially given we touched on Turkey just now, I think it would be good for us to have a sense of whether, if at all, the resolution of the conflict in Libya has more prospects for being reached under a Biden administration. Biden himself has repeatedly emphasized in recent years that he had been against the 2011 intervention against the Gaddafi regime. So I think it's clear this is unlikely to be a priority. But Tobias, I wonder whether you could comment about whether you think, the supposed change that the US is going to undertake when it comes to stress on diplomacy, coordination with partners and allies, somewhat increases the chances of a resolution of the conflict.
Thank you. So I think, of course, the US has a role to play. However, I don't think there is going to be that much scope for a change of policy, at least not in the short to medium term. There are a few reasons for that. Firstly, I think the US is already playing actually quite a significant role over the last few months. So after that brief period where John Bolton reportedly sort of almost authorized Haftar's offensive on Tripoli, after that, there seems to have been a shift. I think the US has seen especially Russia's role increase quite significantly in Libya and has therefore changed tack. And over the last few months, we've seen the US play quite an active role in encouraging some progress on the political, but also on the economic front. So, for example, the US played a key role in getting the oil blockade lifted. It was ultimately an agreement negotiated by and brokered by the Russians, but the US actually applied quite a lot of pressure. Likewise, the US played quite a role sort of behind the, under the surface, kind of uncharacteristically for the Trump era, in paving the way to this Libyan political dialogue forum, which started on Monday in Tunis. So I think the US is already playing a role, and I don't see the Biden administration changing that much in that role. One, because it's working right now anyway. I mean, we'll have to see what it looks like in January when Biden actually takes office. Secondly, there's some scope for change, of course, in terms of tone, right? A different tone from Washington might change the calculations and we've already talked about that, in Ankara, in Abu Dhabi, in Cairo, and all of these other capitals for whom Libya is a much more important issue than it will be for Washington. But then also, I think, and this is the key sort of thing for me to remind, as a reminder for Libya and for US views of Libya, is that with what I think is going to be fairly limited amount of political capital that Biden will be willing to expend on foreign affairs in general, Libya will be very, very far down the sort of list of priorities. Not least because Libya is, the idea, the association between Libya and the whole Benghazi controversy back to 2012, and then Hillary Clinton's endless appearances in front of congressional inquiries, the Fox News media storm around all kinds of conspiracies and all of that. I think the Biden administration will want to stay well clear of that. And so, yeah, I think there's just too much there that speaks against this becoming an issue that the Biden administration will want to spend much time on, expend much capital on. So ultimately, I see mostly continuity in that sort of trying to do stuff below the surface, push, change the tone somewhat, but ultimately not drastically change the policy.
So just building on what we were discussing before, do you think the role of regional actors that we mentioned, in particular Turkey, the Emirates, Egypt, and others, will remain high in Libya moving forward? You don't see any change in that?
So yes, I think for sure. I think all the regional neighbors for some of whom Libya is maybe not quite existential, but a very significant national security issue, or a very significant strategic interest, right? I mean, Egypt, and Hisham can probably talk about this too, Egypt can't suddenly move itself away from having a very, very long, difficult to control border with Libya. Mm-hmm. And I think other regional actors, including Turkey, including the UAE, have already invested quite a lot into this conflict. So, and it's of course one of the theaters where we see that sort of confrontation between the two axes that Hisham outlined. So yeah, I think that is going to continue. And I think this is where one of the questions that I guess we're all trying to answer here is, to what extent a change in tone from Washington is not so much about Washington forcing Ankara to do this or that, or moving Abu Dhabi to do this and that, but rather how a change in tone from Washington changes the calculation and sort of the self-censorship, almost the self-correction in these various capitals. And I think that is the key question.
Thanks, Tobias. Well, the last thing I wanted to touch on before properly opening up to the Q&A was what does this all mean for the UK? Chloe, I wonder whether, putting aside, for a moment, the nature of UK-US relations under a Biden administration, which it's a topic in itself, and we could probably have a whole separate webinar on it, looking specifically at the MENA region and everything that we have been discussing so far. What do you think the US policy in the MENA will mean for the UK? Do you see more areas of convergence than under Trump administrations, or or do you see, any kind of continuity compared to the past?
So I absolutely see more convergence, and I don't think we should push aside the institutional issues because it's been very difficult to deal with the Trump administration because it's so unpredictable and its methodology is not clear. And just to think about an administration which will work in a rather traditional way, in a systematic way, in an interagency way, which likes multilateralism, which puts value in alliances, which doesn't like leaving vacuums all over the place. And we've heard from previous speakers about how when the US leaves the vacuum, often others will move into that, not necessarily in a constructive way. So that's all is what the UK would welcome, and just being easier to work with is something in itself, irrespective of the policy issues. And if we think about UK policy in the Middle East, it's been not that far from the Americans. On Iran, it's been closer to the EU than to the Trump administration. Biden's obviously going to come back a bit from that. And there are all sorts of reasons why the US is going to want to work closely with the UK. Just very briefly, we've, on all the Biden issues like climate change, we've moved on China away from the George Osborne policy, Russia promoting democracy, and that's all underpinned by the long-standing military and intelligence relationships. I do think Ireland, I just want to say something very quickly about Ireland, because there's been a lot in the press about this. And I note that Biden's first calls were to Canada, to the heads of government of Canada, Ireland, UK, Germany, and France. I thought that's quite interesting that Ireland's right up there. He's making a point. But the view from within the Tory party is that the Brexit thing will not be a major disruptor, because by the time Biden comes into office, either the UK will have come to a deal with the EU, in which case the internal market bill doesn't come into effect, or there'll be a no-deal Brexit, in which case the UK or Tory party will argue that the EU negotiated in bad faith. And if you look at the joint declaration, there's all sorts of bits there which you could argue, and they would argue, that the EU was acting in bad faith, and it would be a fait accompli. One other thing on the UK government, the UK government's completely preoccupied with two big crises: COVID, which is going to go on for another 6 months, and Brexit, which is going to go on even longer. Even if there is a deal, there will be so much disruption at borders. Even a free trade agreement, no tariffs, no quotas, there will be paperwork, which everybody's unused to. It will be disruptive. So the UK is not going to be very active for at least 6 months, possibly a year. It'll have a US administration who's much easier to work with. So actually, I think it's all pretty good.
Thanks, Clovis. Can I tease out one specific question on the potential reaction from the UK, given what we discussed, specifically when it comes to Yemen? I mean, obviously, if there is a halt in US support for the US Saudi-led war in Yemen, there might be some implication for the UK as well. So I wonder, I mean, this is something that has been coming up in other discussions as well. And I wonder whether I can get a sense of what you think. Do you think there would be a repositioning from the UK as a result of a potential change in the US strategy?
Yeah, I'm not a Yemen expert, I'm afraid. On the other places where UK forces are or have been engaged, the UK is not going to be isolated. It's not going to be the sole provider of forces. It's always going to want to go along with the Americans. If the Americans are not there, it will go, because there are certainly no vital national interests at stake in Yemen, for sure.
That makes sense. Thank you. We'll come back to the UK. I see there are a couple of questions that are related to the European position as well, and the UK position. So I'll come back to you, but I wonder whether I can start asking a first question to Antonio. There is a question from Narayan Kumar asking about whether, considering the ongoing Taliban offensive and terrorist attacks, if the US under the new administration withdraws, does that mean a complete Taliban takeover of Kabul?
Right. Well, I don't think even the Taliban want a complete military takeover of Kabul. And that's why they've been sitting at the table, either with the Americans or with Kabul, for all this time. The Taliban leadership is not the village mullahs that they were in 1994. They've been traveling, seeing the region. They've been to the Gulf a lot, for sure, Dubai, in particular, the Emirates, but also Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf countries. They've been to Iran, of course, to Pakistan. They were going perhaps even before. They've been as far as Russia and Norway. So they know a little bit more of the world, and they also have experience of being in government. They've been in the Emirates, and they know how hard it was to run and rebuild a landlocked country, even if you are in full control of Kabul. So, you know, being in control of a completely isolated country in the mountains is not such a great deal. You know, so what they need is, yes, they want power. They want to legitimize as much as possible their ascent to power. That's why they are interested in a deal. Of course, they want to be on top. You know, they don't plan to be in government as a junior coalition partner. They want to be the top player in Kabul, but they want to have allies and want to frame it in such a way that it's acceptable, not only to the Americans, although the relation with the Americans is of interest to them. They also expect the Americans to contribute, to keep contributing in the future to rebuilding Afghanistan, but also the region, because, you know, for Afghanistan to be viable as a country, needs to have decent relation with the borders. It's a landlocked country. It's not an island in the Pacific. So they need to have good relations, not only with Pakistan. Even Pakistan doesn't want to complete Taliban takeover because that would upset the Americans and wouldn't be good for Pakistan's relation with Washington. They're trying to rebuild. You know, they don't want to push Washington completely in the hands of Delhi, which is already, you know, they're already getting far too close for Islamabad's liking. But in particular, the North, the Russians, the Chinese, the Central Asians, the Taliban need these guys. They need to trade with them. They need them to invest. They need to build infrastructure that allows for movement of goods and people also northwards, not only southwards. And they also ideally need good relation with Iran if possible, decent relations. So they know that if you take a power militarily, they will be in control of Kabul. They won't be recognized by hardly anybody. They won't have trade relations. The Iranians, the Russians, perhaps the Chinese, the Indians will all support opposition to the Taliban as they did in the 90s. So it will be a never-ending war. They know they can fully control Afghanistan if you have most of the regional countries against you. And the Pakistanis also know that. So it's not that they are becoming liberal Democrats, the Taliban, but just more experience. And they just know that, you know, the only way to get to power is to follow the plan. Now, the problem is not that. The problem is that to get to this point, Khalid Dad made a number of promises to the Taliban, as he did to a lot of other people, and is not delivered. You know, he had promised that the Taliban, Ghani wouldn't be there, Ghani would be removed, Ghani would not be in power. They wouldn't negotiate with Ghani, or they would negotiate at least with an independent, autonomous delegation in Doha, which is not there. The delegation in Doha is totally under Ghani's control. So the Taliban didn't get what Khalid Dad promised them, and now they found themselves in Doha with a counterpart that can't really agree on anything with. So the military pressure they are building up is basically a substitute of the pressure that the Americans were supposed to exercise on Ghani, and they tried to some extent, but Ghani proved to be much more resilient than anybody expected. So he's still there and still has full control. In fact, he's got more control now than he had a year ago because, you know, he's passed the elections as well. So that is the difference, and that's why the situation militarily is complicated. Of course, there is a possibility, I think quite a strong possibility, of the current talks in Doha collapsing. You know, the military pressure of the Taliban create a situation where, you know, continuing is problematic. What will the Americans do? Will the Americans leave or stay? The problem is that if they stay, then they have to engage in fighting. You know, they don't want to stay there and see the Afghan government collapsing under your nose. They're going to be even worse. You need to engage. They don't have the forces now to make a difference on the ground, really. So I think what Biden will try to do is try to commit the Taliban to go for some kind of reasonable exit, a bit like Trump tried to do, perhaps bringing in different people, Taliban's credibility might be compromised at this point, although of course he knows all the actors very well. So bring maybe somebody else and try to have a restart and see whether they can get going with the inter-Afghan talks, or at least have an understanding with the Taliban about, guarantees that they won't go for a military takeover, the Taliban and the regional actors, particularly Pakistan. And the Taliban are much closer than they were last year to the Saudis. And, of course, one of the reasons why they do that, because they believe the Saudis have a direct line to Washington, which it was the case under the Trump administration, as we already have discussed. They might no longer be the case with Biden, but it's still better to have Saudi Arabia as a key partner than Iran if you do want to talk to the Americans. So I think the distance from Iran, getting closer to the Saudis, is one of the tools they're using to see whether they can reach an accommodation with Americans. It's not impossible the Americans may close one eye to a Taliban kind of takeover, but I think the strategy is not an assault on Kabul, is essentially put up pressure and favor a coup in Kabul, basically. The political opposition has already been trying to remove Ghani from power, maybe with a bit of help from the Taliban entering some cities, bringing the war to the cities. That could be something that make that a bit easier to accomplish. I'm still not very optimistic that there is an easy solution to this.
Thanks, Antonio. Well, staying in Afghanistan, but also moving to Iraq, there is a question by General Vincenzo Camporini, who was the former chief of defense in Europe. He says that we have been referring to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as American wars, whereas these are international missions, surely led by the US. So I think his question is, what do you think? And this question is both for Antonio, but also for Gareth. What do you think about Washington taking decisions without consulting with other countries, which have thousands of troops? Why don't you start, Antonio, and then I ask Gareth to move into the Iraq.
Well, certainly, this negotiation with the Taliban so far have not been really seen a lot of consultation between Washington as NATO partners. In part, I think that's inevitable, because when you do this kind of diplomacy, you can't involve too many people. Necessarily, many of these efforts have to be very discreet. You involve too many people, then the secrets of these talks just simply disappears. I think, of course, there are different also views about what to do in Afghanistan. But at least on something, Trump was right, that the actual fighting and the bulk of the cost of being in Afghanistan was borne by the Americans. Of course, it was a joke, but when the Americans were saying ISAF means I saw Americans fighting, it was not completely unfair. There was certainly an imbalance. And this imbalance is particularly obvious today when Europeans argue, we should defend the achievements of this intervention in Afghanistan of 20 years, but the Americans should be fighting. So the Europeans are not willing to send combat troops to Afghanistan. Of course, it's difficult logistically, but I think if they really want to, they could keep a small contingent fighting in Afghanistan. They don't want. They expect the Americans to do that, and the Americans are tired. And politically, I don't think there is any political support at any level in America for engaging in this war. So one has to be realistic. If whoever wants this war to continue, has also to say who should be fighting there.
Gareth, why don't you take it from there for Iraq?
Yeah, I think Iraq, again, is similar in some ways. However, we do have Operation Inherent Resolve, the Combined Joint Task Force, based out of Kuwait, which is a very heavily multinational mission, and which is that still does have a significant role to play in Iraq. However, the Americans are still by far the leading force, the leading provider of logistics and material and intelligence, and it's difficult to imagine a military presence operating in Iraq without that significant American involvement with it. In terms of how far the Americans will negotiate with other powers, I'm uncertain. I mean, the focus for the Americans in Iraq is still, and for CJTF, is still very much an anti-ISIS mission. And so anything that happens in terms of the CJTF's involvement in Iraq is very much focused on anti-ISIS, and alongside that, of course, we then have very political developments such as a possible American re-entry into JCPOA, which could these things all sort of juggle and fit together. So do we then see some form of invigoration of CJTF on an anti-terrorism mandate that is worked into some sort of agreement with on the JCPOA that allows that sort of mission to further itself? And what would that relationship with the Iranians, what would the cost of that be? I mean, it would almost certainly be something to do with Iran's economy and sanctions waivers on oil exports and that sort of thing. So there is a complex sort of kaleidoscopic puzzle that goes on around the Americans, the multinational involvement, the relationship with Iran, and where they go from there. I think perhaps it's a little bit more complicated with Iraq than Afghanistan in that sort of respect.
Thanks, Garrett. There is a related question in terms of the activities of Daesh and the rise in these activities over the past few months. And the question is, how would the Biden administration ensure the US and Iraq do not end up in a similar situation to 2011? Easy question.
Well, in some ways it is, because it's to make sure that the conditions that allowed for the formation of ISIS in 2011 are not replicated today. And a lot of work has gone into understanding the rise of Islamic State and what the thresholds that were passed that allowed it to happen. And what we see today is quite worrying. It's the marginalization of predominantly Sunni Arab governorates in the north of Iraq, so Salahuddin, Nineveh, Diyala. And that has continued even more so since 2016-17. So we still see vast areas of those territories that have not been reconstructed, that are not being politically and economically incorporated back into the Iraqi state, that are subject to the extrajudicial powers of Shia militias that are based around there. So we need to see some sort of resolution of these problems of the return of some degree of normality to these governorates in the north, to a calming of the security situation. There is a resurgent ISIS presence in area from Jabal Hamrim up to Diyala and the borders of the Kurdistan region. So there needs to be some sort of joint security mechanism, which again the Americans were very good at facilitating between Iraqi security forces, Peshmerga forces from Kurdistan, and local security forces as well. That could be a very significant American role to play in reinvigorating that. But again, it does need some degree of Iranian compliance with that to allow it to happen. And then there needs to be some sort of rebuilding of I suppose the political representation of Sunni Arabs and Turkmens and those who don't feel that the current range of Iraqi political parties represent them. There needs to be some reconstruction of the democratic structure that allows a re-engagement of these provinces back into the body politic of Iraq as a whole, which simply isn't there right now. So these are very, very significant jobs, but there are roles that the Americans have performed, sometimes led on in the past, and this is an area of activity that Biden has been involved in as vice president before. So if anyone knows how to do it, he does, but the scale of the job is absolutely massive now. Thanks,
Garrett. Well, I wanted to ask a couple of questions on the GCC. I'll try to be brief, so I know we have a lot of questions. There is one on Oman and what role it might play in facilitating discourse between the US and Iran. Mike, I wonder whether you want to have a go.
Sure. Not a very big one, because let's be honest, all the people that talk to the Iranians 5 years ago are now coming back to the Biden administration. So there doesn't need to be an interlocutor. How do I put this politely? The interlocutor passed away earlier this year anyway. Sultan Haytham is not Sultan Qaboos in terms of his ability to connect to Iran in that way, or his desire to play that role. The Omanis have bigger problems on their plate at the moment, primarily getting enough money to pay their loans back at the beginning of next year. So the JCPOA stuff, well, name your person in the Biden team. I mean, so many of them have experience on this file. I guess it's just a question of how they approach it. We've had this conversation for so many years now about what went wrong with JCPOA, and you can approach it from the very technical wonk side and the sunset clauses and all that, or you can approach it from the regional security side. If you can approach it from the regional security side, then I think we're going to be here till kingdom come, because I just think it's too complicated to unravel all of those issues. So the question is, using sort of diplomatic term, do you put these in separate baskets and deal with them at the same time, or do you deal with one and then the other? Or do you try and just deal with little slivers of issues? You mentioned Yemen or the Qatar issue or something, or Iraq. You could do that, but you're only ever going to get small wins. So I think that it'd be interesting to see how they re-engage on the JCPOA. I just don't think it'd be through Oman.
Thanks, Mike. And a question from Sam from Bicom for both you and Hisham as well about the Israel posture, given that Biden is likely to prefer diplomacy when it comes to Iran. So his question is, does this diminish the credibility of Israel's military strike option? And do you think Israel will succeed in influencing how Biden approaches Iran regarding the JCPOA?
Sure. Israel hasn't had a military strike option since about 2010. Not realistically. Ehud Barak talked about the window of opportunity closing at that point. I don't think that ever really reopened. And yeah, okay, you could, given the new realities in the Middle East, get Israeli aircraft to fly over northern Saudi airspace. I just don't think that the Saudis would be willing to go down that road anytime soon. And I wouldn't see much facilitation from the Biden administration on that front. The Americans are still pretty clear about where the red lines are. There's no doubt in my mind that the US, if Iran does sanctions bust or whatever, and this goes back to my original point, was it half an hour ago, we need to see what sanctions are coming down the line from the Trump administration to understand how and in what ways Iran might be said to have broken those sanctions or the conditions for those sanctions, and whether that would then behoove a response from Biden. If Biden starts unilaterally undoing them, then that would be seen as going easy on Iran, which you know better than me, but there are certain areas to do with their enrichment volumes and things like that, which are in breach of the accord. So all in all, look, Israel's deterrent posture is pretty safe. I think we all know they've got a nuclear weapon. That's not really been much of a contentious issue for a long time. Deterrence is pretty stable. If you want to talk about where the main issue for Israel is, it's in Western Syria and it's with Hezbollah, which is another question altogether, which we probably don't have time for. But what I would say is this. Does the Biden administration think that putting pressure on Hezbollah would lead to a better outcome in Lebanon? And the answer is yes. I don't see much daylight between them and the Trump approach.
Thank you, Mike. Hisham, do you want to touch on the question as well?
Just briefly, which is to say that I'm here obviously as a senior associate with RUSI, but I'm also a scholar at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, D.C. And in D.C., there's been a growing concern over the past few years that within the analytical arena, that the Israelis, particularly through Netanyahu's administration, has really damaged the relationship. Not to say that Biden is suddenly going to become anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian, but has made the discussion around Israel less of a bipartisan issue. Okay, so there are clear differences that are emerging within the different political parties. And you see that very clearly over the last few years with quote unquote members of the squad within the Democratic Party. So in that regard, I think that there's a very important trend to keep track of and be aware of. Again, the discussion in DC is very, I mean, we're having discussion in London. The discussion in DC is very different than London. Okay, the way in which London and the EU and frankly most of the world looks at the Palestinian-Israeli conflict would be considered to be almost far left in a Washington DC discussion. We tend to center things like international law far more prominently. So I do think that that's not really going to change in the short term, but there is that trend within the Democratic Party that is pushing against the establishment in the Democratic Party, and that quote-unquote progressive squad is certainly moving the goalposts when it comes to what the Democrats are going to be willing to do with regards to the Palestinians and the Israelis, but not in the short term, in my opinion.
Thank you, Hisham. And there is a question about how you see a Biden presidency affecting key policy priorities for Egypt. There is specifically a reference to Ethiopia, the Libyan crisis, and Turkish encroachment in East Med. Can you take that as well?
I'll take that, and I'll try to be very brief because I think that there are probably a lot of people that have questions, and I'd like to hear from my colleagues as well. But just very briefly, there are a number of very important priorities for Cairo at the moment that relate to the dam in Ethiopia, with regards to Libya as well, and of course the more general sort of Eastern Mediterranean question, which Zia also touched on. Now, the Trump administration took a lot of energy, or rather expended a lot of energy in trying to bring the different parties together on the dam. I'm not sure how Biden is going to actually take that point on. And that will concern Cairo tremendously because the dam is genuinely a very serious national security issue. Now, Ethiopia has its own problems at the moment, as we haven't talked about this, it falls out of our discussion today, but Ethiopia is facing a bit of an insurgency, and there's been a lot of activity on the ground in Ethiopia. I'm not sure how much that is going to play out in how Ethiopia then engages on the dam issue. But certainly I think that any State Department is going to recognize that Cairo takes the dam extremely seriously. And the question will be, how much will actually change as a result of a change of administration at the top? Because I don't think that it was actually down to Trump taking a serious policy decision, even though he mentioned the conflict when he announced a normalization deal with Sudan. I frankly think that was Trump being Trump and just speaking off the cuff. So we wait to see what Biden's going to do. When it comes to Libya, as Tobias actually mentioned, Libya is a very serious, genuine problem for Cairo. It's very concerned about how militias on the other side of the border are proceeding. And I think Cairo was actually quite grateful to the Trump administration to sort of hold that back a little bit. And I don't presume that under a Biden administration, that's really going to change all that much, because the assessment, I don't think is all that different between Cairo and DC on this point within the institutional apparatuses that exist. I'll stop there to give others the chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Hisham, much appreciated. Zia, there are a couple of questions on the East Med. One specifically from Alan Roberts asks, what do you think about the potential for NATO and the UK increased resource given the Turkish aggression and increased Russian presence in the East Med?
Well, look, obviously Cyprus matters for the UK, right? We have sovereign territories, we have military bases, we have a historical presence in the island. UK has played a really constructive role in all of the peace initiatives under UN. I mean, if you look at even the last talks in Crans-Montana and before, etc. So I think from London's perspective, unification of the island, you know, kind of UN plan based, established on the unknown was still the best case scenario. It should still be possible, but given the fact that regional dynamics have changed, things are not looking likely. But the UK is really not necessarily going to take a line on one side or the other in such a way that it will antagonize another. That's just not UK's focus. So the military bases they're already in use by us, by our allies, and etc. So their significance has already been there. Would UK undertake a build-up of military presence on the island as a political positioning? I highly doubt so, right? So the question of Russian activities in the East Med has been a concern. Their renovation of the purchase of, well, the renting of the port in Tarsus in Syria, their activities not so successful, but to a certain extent in Libya. That is a wider NATO question, which is the question of strategic South, rather than just the UK kind of US perspectives. There's already, I think, a recognition within the NATO that, yes, we have focused on Russian activities in the north and the east, but the Black Sea and the Aegean and the Med has been ignored. And actually now the tensions between NATO allies, i.e. Greece and Turkey, has a pattern. They've been going on for decades. So some of these issues are not new. And NATO's role to contain it and create de-escalation mechanisms to be able to provide a chance for diplomatic solutions is working. I mean, in other words, NATO is actually part of the solution to contain the fallout between Greece and Turkey. Question of Cyprus is a more of an EU question. And sadly, the EU still doesn't necessarily have a push to solve that. And a lot of actors don't necessarily want to. So from a British perspective, things are precarious, and hopefully we will see a deal, again, that brings both sides to the table to find a compromise. But again, a lot of that also depends upon the regional developments, right? The relationship between Greece and UAE and Egypt. Again, the new trilateral forum that was announced, I think, this week, Israel's policies. So I think boxing of Turkey is always going to backfire if your only ambition is boxing Turkey because you are UAE, you have issues with Turkey. You're Israel, you have issues with Turkey. You're Egypt, you have issues with Turkey. You're Greece, you have issues with Turkey. You're Cyprus, etc. But from a British perspective, and then what? So I think, and then what question is still not clear to anybody in NATO. And President Macron's anger towards Turkey on Libya is, I find it very troubling because he was the one who backed the Russian presence, and he was the one who backed the Haftar forces that actually undermined both NATO and US and UN recognized government in Tripoli, etc. So the picture is really messy. I think a change in US perspectives on the Met, from Pompeo's trips to Greece but not to Turkey, or messaging over Cyprus, might provide us, again, that kind of a focus on saying, hey guys, this is not a new issue. It's escalating because there are a lot of regional interests unfolding that has nothing to do with Cyprus or Greece and Turkey triangle. We cannot let this to be taken to that direction. I think that would be the wisest option for Biden. And I think that would what UK want. That is actually what NATO wants. But again, Ankara now is in a reactionary mood and a box. That it pretty much sees every nail on horizon and it sees itself as a hammer. To what extent Ankara will also return to a more constructive diplomacy rather than asserting first and then hoping a diplomatic solution emerges, that is also yet to be seen because Turkish economy is not doing well. And energy resource question, the recent findings in Black Sea brought some excitement, but again, these are not, never-ending lucrative resources. And again, questioning energy possibilities of the shores of Cyprus is also probably limited. It's not as lucrative as maybe some of the the focus on the crisis has created. But my concern isn't so much so Ankara and Athens not being able to talk bilaterally. If US policy untangles itself from the current box it has entered because of Trump's approach to some of the UAE and Israel and Egypt and other issues, then we might see a positive direction. But if not, we will only see what we have already seen, which is an unresolved Cyprus, undermining any possibility of EU-Turkey moving on from accession framework to something meaningful, and a desire driven by Egypt, UAE, and Israel, and Greece and Cyprus to just box Turkey. And that will always backfire.
Thanks, Zia. Clovis, I think you wanted to jump in as well, right?
Yeah, just three quick things. The first is our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is quite interested in Turkey, not least because of his own heritage. And he's been ringing Erdogan probably every 2 or 3 months. And the line is always, at least the public line, dialogue, talk to Greece, sort it out, negotiate. And as Zia has said, I can't see that the UK forces would have any relevance in that. The next point is that if there is a confrontation between the EU and Turkey, led presumably by France, then it's quite clear that the UK would be on the side of the EU and France. So however much Boris likes Turkey, that's not going to make that much difference. Final point is that US leverage over Turkey is unilateral leverage is quite limited. So the US is, as Zia has said, is going to have to work with the EU and others if it's going to try and encourage a negotiated solution. But at the moment, everybody, because of the support for Greece, there's not much pressure on Greece to negotiate.
Thanks, Clovis. I wonder if I can keep you just to ask you another question, which is from Amira, both to you and Tobias. And with this, I think we will conclude. Given the shift of the center of attention to Asia, how can the EU, and I extend the question also to the UK for you, Clovis, in particular, how can the EU and the UK keep the US interested in their affairs, especially in the immediate neighborhood, South Mediterranean, but generally speaking, how can they ensure there is a convergence of policy?
Tobias, do you want to go first? All right, I'll go. So I think a lot of this is about US political support rather than physical support, military support. So long as the UK and EU, for that more importantly, have got US political support, I think that will make the difference. And the US focus and shift to Asia is entirely understandable, but it's essentially a shift of military might and diplomatic effort. It's not a complete, it's not to mean that it's going to ignore the rest of the world. And of course, the US was always big in Asia. It's been big in Asia since the 20s. So I think the key will be to make them interested through the multilateral engagement, which we know the Biden administration will be keen on.
Thank you, Clovis. Tobias.
Yeah, so so whilst in London, at least some media outlets have speculated whether a Trump administration might be better for the UK, in Berlin, most certainly, those questions were never asked. There, I think the collective sigh of relief was rather substantial that Mr. Biden has won. Now, I think there is some fantasy in Europe. There's some fantasy with regards to, and especially in Berlin, with regards to whether the US might now care a little bit less about the 2%. I think that would be rather foolish for European capital to think that, and most certainly for Germany to think that. However, I do think there is some scope to keep the Americans interested in European security and European security with regards to the Middle East, especially by not necessarily just demonstrating willingness to spend money, but willingness to actually make an effort politically as well. So I think whilst the Trump administration was very focused on these numerical indicators, I think there is some scope with the Biden administration to show commitment on other levels too, and have that recognized in a way. And that makes it, I think, easier for, that is something that certainly people in Berlin, but also I think in other European capitals are more comfortable with. And so I think though, more just like it was under Obama, and I think Libya is perhaps a really good example of this, the Obama administration made it very clear that Libya is Europe's problem. And you had the whole like leading from behind, that kind of stuff, and ultimately the US military just taking the wheel eventually because the European militaries were not capable of doing it. So I think that won't change. And so Europe will eventually have to confront this question that arguably Libya and North Africa should be and is one of its absolute vital national security interests. I mean, the we always talk about the migration crisis from 2015 and then onwards as one that was about Syria and about migrants coming from Syria through Turkey into Europe. But actually the numbers coming through the Mediterranean through the Libya route were just as high, if not higher. And that continues to be a massive issue. So I think on that, if Europe wants US support, it doesn't necessarily just have to show financial commitments, but actual political and to an extent military commitments, and just show what Europe is doing. And things like the Irene operation in the Mediterranean are a good start, even though they are very much sort of tinkering around the edges, would be my personal view anyway.
Thank you, Tobias. Hisham, your 2 final cents.
Very, very quickly. There are institutional changes within Washington that have taken place under Donald Trump, and one of them has to do, indeed, as Tobias mentioned, the encouragement of Europe to develop its own military capacity, and the second is the recognition of China being a fundamental problem for how international order will proceed in the next 10, 20, 30 years. I don't think that's going to change under Biden. I think that actually that was met with approval within the institutions that matter in DC. And I suspect that that's going to be something that carries on. It might change in terms of how they apply those concerns, but I don't think that that will change. And I think that London, as well as the European Union, should take that really very much on board.
Thank you, Hisham. Look, I'm not going to try to summarize everything that we have said because we literally toured the whole Middle East and North Africa. We cover a lot of ground, touching virtually on all issues. So I'm hoping that we can get an opportunity to deep dive on each of the countries that we mentioned, the conflict that we mentioned moving forward. We are certainly going to be watching all of them closely. So to stay up to date to our activities, sign up to our newsletter, see what we have in the pipeline. Already on Monday, we have an event looking at the views from Tehran on the Biden administration. So I saw there are a lot of questions on the JCPOA and the US-Iran relations. We'll be covering those much more in depth on Monday. But for now, really, I want to thank our excellent speakers for doing a wonderful job today and for really covering a lot of ground with a lot of depth. And I want to wish you all a lovely rest of the day, wherever you are. And I hope you stay safe and to see you all very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Anissa.